Los Angeles had turned into a furnace. The horizon was painted with streaks of crimson and ash, and the air felt like breathing through embers. From the balcony of his penthouse suite at the Beverly Regent, Barron Trump stood silently, his tall figure outlined against the choking orange haze. The sound of distant sirens cut through the eerie quiet, an endless symphony of panic. Below, the streets writhed with chaos, families loading their cars, pets howling in fear, and ash falling like dead snow. Barron's sharp blue eyes scanned the scene. Something wasn't right. He had been in Los Angeles before, but this trip wasn't for pleasure. While most thought of him as just the youngest Trump, Barron's reserved demeanor hid a keen mind. Tonight, though, even he felt powerless against the firestorm devouring the city. Yet, as his gaze drifted to the distant hills of Griffith Park, something caught his attention. A faint, rhythmic blinking. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, smoke dancing against flames. But no, it was deliberate, a flash, then a pause, then another flash. Pattern. He furrowed his brow. What could possibly be blinking in an area already engulfed by fire? Barron, please come inside. His assistant, Julia Morgan, called from the suite's glass doors. Her voice quivered slightly, her professional calm cracking under the weight of the disaster outside. But Barron didn't move. His pulse quickened as he focused on the mysterious light. A strange unease settled in his chest. What was it? A signal? A distress call? He couldn't explain why, but something about that blinking felt urgent. And just like that, Barron knew he had to find out what it was. The rhythmic blinking refused to leave Barron's mind, even as he reluctantly stepped back inside. The suite, though luxurious, felt suffocating under the weight of the wildfires raging just beyond its glass walls. The distant sound of crackling flames seemed to grow louder, merging with the chaos on the streets below. Julia's voice, usually steady and professional, carried an edge of desperation as she repeated warnings from the news. Evacuations are expanding to all of Griffith Park and surrounding neighborhoods, she said, scrolling through her tablet. The fire department says it's spreading faster than predicted. Barron barely heard her. His thoughts lingered on that light, so deliberate, so out of place. His gut told him it wasn't random. He moved to the window again, ignoring Julia's concerned glance. The orange glow of the horizon seemed closer now. The city below, an unsettling mix of life and destruction. Families with packed cars rushed through smoky streets, their faces a mix of fear and exhaustion. The distant hills, once a symbol of LA's grandeur, now resembled the edge of a living hell. Barron clenched his fists. Something about that blinking called to him, pulling at his instincts like a thread unraveling a tightly wound knot. He turned to Julia abruptly, his voice firm. Something's happening out there, Julia. I saw a blinking light near Griffith Park. Julia frowned. Barron, with everything going on, it's probably nothing. A fire truck, maybe. Or equipment. No, Barron interrupted, his voice sharper than usual. It wasn't random. It was intentional. For a moment, their eyes locked, Julia hesitating as she saw the conviction in his gaze. He wasn't guessing. He knew. And though she didn't say it, something in her gut twisted, too. The tension in the room was palpable as Julia finally nodded, though her skepticism lingered. Fine, she said, her voice a mix of reluctance and resignation. But you're not stepping out of this suite. Barron barely acknowledged her as he reached for a pair of binoculars that had been left on the side table, a standard feature in the penthouse for guests to admire LA's famous vistas. Tonight, they would serve a far more urgent purpose. He stepped back onto the balcony, his heart pounding in sync with the faint rhythm of the blinking light. Through the binoculars, the city came alive in startling detail. Cars trapped in gridlocked streets, firefighters battling the advancing inferno, people clutching what few belongings they could carry. Yet his focus remained on the hills of Griffith Park, where the light persisted, its pulse steady and deliberate. Barron adjusted the focus, his breathing shallow. And there it was. Not a fire truck or emergency vehicle, as Julia had suggested, but a small metallic structure partially obscured by smoke and flames. The blinking came from a single light affixed to its roof. It looked out of place, too calculated, too deliberate to be anything ordinary. His stomach churned. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled with unease. This wasn't just a coincidence. Something or someone was signaling for attention. "Julia," he called, his voice tight. She appeared in the doorway, her concern now tinged with curiosity. "It's not equipment," Barron said, lowering the binoculars. His expression was a mix of urgency and dread. "It's a structure, and whatever's there, it doesn't belong." Julia's eyes widened, her own sense of foreboding rising. "What are you saying?" Barron looked back at the glowing hills, his jaw set. "I think someone or something is out there, waiting for us to notice." Barron's words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Julia crossed her arms, as though shielding herself from the weight of it. "Barron, you can't be serious," she said, her voice faltering. But deep down, she saw the determination in his eyes, the unshakable certainty that had always set him apart. He didn't argue. Instead, he walked past her into the suite, grabbing his phone. Julia followed, her steps quick and uneasy. "Who are you calling?" "Someone who might actually listen," he said, dialing the Los Angeles Fire Department's emergency line. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Captain Greg Lawson, LA County Fire." Barron didn't waste a second. "This is Barron Trump. I'm calling about something I've noticed near Griffith Park. Something that doesn't make sense." There was a pause on the other end, the name clearly catching Lawson's attention. "Mr. Trump," he said, his tone careful. "I appreciate the concern, but we're dealing with a massive firestorm here. Every unit is stretched thin." "I understand that," Barron replied, his voice calm but insistent. "But this is important. There's a blinking light coming from a structure in the middle of the fire zone. It's deliberate, like a signal. You need to send someone to check it out." Lawson sighed, the weight of the night evident in his voice. "Probably a faulty alarm system," he muttered. "Happens all the time in these situations." "It's not a glitch," Barron pressed. "You don't have to believe me, but if I'm right and you ignore this, the consequences could be catastrophic." Something in his tone cut through Lawson's fatigue. After a long silence, the captain relented. "All right," he said, "I'll send a team to investigate, but they can't stay long. If it's nothing, they're pulling out." As the call ended, Julia looked at Barron, her face pale. "You really think this is going to change anything?" Barron's gaze returned to the window, to the blinking light that had already changed everything. "We'll find out soon enough," he said quietly. The fire crew moved swiftly, navigating through winding streets choked with smoke and chaos. Captain Greg Lawson led the team, his expression a mixture of skepticism and urgency. The city had taught him to trust his instincts, but tonight, he couldn't shake the weight of Barron's warning. If the youngest Trump was right, there was no room for mistakes. Through the thick haze, Griffith Park emerged, a blackened wasteland with flames licking at its edges. The rhythmic blinking grew clearer as they approached, a faint yet steady beacon cutting through the devastation. It led them to an unassuming structure partially hidden beneath the charred remains of trees. "What the hell is this?" one of the firefighters muttered, shining his flashlight on the metallic walls. It was no ordinary building. The steel frame was reinforced, the doors thick and bolted. The blinking light came from a small alarm box above the entrance. Lawson's stomach tightened as he approached. "Get that door open," he ordered. The firefighters worked quickly, prying the heavy doors apart. The smell hit them first, a sharp, acrid odor that made their eyes water. Inside, the air was heavy with the hum of machinery. Rows of barrels lined the walls, each marked with hazardous material warnings. "Captain," one of the crew called, his voice tense, "these aren't just chemicals. They're accelerants." Lawson's blood ran cold. The barrels contained substances so volatile that if the fire reached them, the explosion could level half the city. His radio crackled to life, but he barely heard it over the pounding of his heart. He turned to his team. "We need immediate containment here. Get hazmat on site now." As the gravity of the discovery sank in, One thought consumed him. Barron Trump had just saved Los Angeles from an unimaginable catastrophe. The news of the discovery spread faster than wildfire itself. By the time Barron returned to his suite, his phone was buzzing relentlessly. Social media had erupted. Hashtags like #HeroTrump and #GriffithsRescue trended worldwide. Journalists camped outside the Beverly Regent, desperate for a soundbite, a glimpse of the young man who had seemingly uncovered a city-shattering secret. Julia hovered near the window, watching the chaos unfold through a sea of flashing lights and cameras. "This isn't going away anytime soon," she said, her voice a whisper. Barron sat quietly in his chair, scrolling through endless notifications. Despite the praise, a knot of unease sat heavy in his chest. His mind replayed the events, the blinking light, the structure, the chemicals, and the faces of the firefighters who risked their lives to contain the threat. Suddenly, his phone buzzed again. A message from Rachel Hart, a prominent investigative journalist. "We need to talk. There's more." Barron opened the message and responded with a simple, "Where?" The journalist arrived within the hour, her presence sharp and calculated. Rachel's questions were direct, her tone steady even as the media frenzy swelled outside. "You knew something bigger was going on," she said, a notebook in hand. "What else did you see?" Barron recounted the details, the blinking light, the chemical barrels, and the unsettling documents they found within the structure. Rachel listened intently, her expressions shifting from skepticism to genuine interest. "This isn't just an accident," she said after a moment. "This was planned." As the conversation continued, Barron realized just how deep the conspiracy went. High-level corporations, powerful figures, and shady deals hidden in the chaos of a citywide disaster. And now they were after him. The room fell silent after Rachel's revelation. Barron leaned back, his mind racing. The scale of the conspiracy was far greater than anyone had initially imagined. The chemicals stored in Griffith Park weren't an isolated incident. They were part of a coordinated plan to manipulate disasters for profit and power. "Barron," Rachel said carefully, her voice low, "whoever's behind this has been planning for months. The chemicals were just the final piece. They wanted the wildfires to rage out of control, knowing they could turn a profit by controlling the aftermath." Barron's jaw tightened. The idea was unfathomable, using a disaster as a tool for financial gain. Yet the evidence was mounting. The mysterious structure, the locked documents, and the strange operations hidden from public view. "They're monitoring the situation," Rachel continued. "They've been watching the fire unfold, making sure nothing threatens their plan. And you've become a liability." Barron sat in silence, absorbing her words. "What do you mean?" he finally asked, his voice low but steady. "They'll do whatever it takes to protect their operation," Rachel said, her expression grim, "including silencing anyone who threatens to expose them." Barron's hands clenched the armrests of his chair. His instinct told him that this was only the beginning. The structure had been dismantled, the chemicals contained, but the threat wasn't over. It had only just begun to show its true face. "I'm not backing down," Barron said firmly. "Not now. Not when so many lives are at stake." Rachel gave a small nod. "Then we dig deeper. We uncover every detail, no matter the cost." As the flames outside flickered in the night, Barron realized that the fight wasn't over. It had only begun. The days following the revelation were a whirlwind of surveillance, threats, and half-truths. Barron's every move was scrutinized, his communications intercepted, his safety compromised. Even with Julia by his side, the sense of vulnerability hung heavy. Trust was something few could afford in moments like these, and every contact felt like a risk. In the shadows, forces worked tirelessly to piece together how much Barron knew and who else might be involved. Rachel continued her investigation, connecting dots that traced back through the city's most powerful figures. Each lead brought them closer to a web of corruption rooted deep within LA's infrastructure. "You can't trust anyone," Rachel warned during one late-night meeting, her eyes sharp in the dim light. "Not politicians, not law enforcement. They're all compromised." Barron listened carefully, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. He remembered the blinking light, the deliberate signal that had begun this journey. What had started as a strange discovery had turned into a mission to expose a conspiracy that stretched far beyond Griffith Park. Suddenly, Barron's phone vibrated. A text from an anonymous number. "They're watching you. Be careful." He tensed. "It's them," he muttered, showing the message to Rachel. "They know we're digging deeper." Rachel's face hardened. "Then we move faster. We can't afford to hesitate." Every conversation felt like stepping through a minefield, every move a potential trap. Julia's warnings grew more urgent, and even the simplest actions, like arranging a meeting or reaching out to contacts, became calculated risks. Barron felt the weight of isolation pressing down harder. Yet he refused to back down. They had come too far. The truth was within reach, and he wasn't going to let fear stop him. The night of reckoning had arrived. Barron, Rachel, and Julia stood beneath the glow of a dim street lamp, a deserted alley in downtown Los Angeles, their final meeting place. Tension crackled in the air as the sound of distant sirens echoed through the empty streets. "Their grip is tightening," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're circling, trying to trap us." Barron looked at her, his jaw clenched. "Then we make sure they know we're ready to fight back." Inside a weathered backpack, Barron carried the evidence they had gathered. A trove of incriminating documents, recordings, and photographs. It was all they had to expose the web of corruption. If they could get it to the right hands, the truth would finally see the light. Suddenly, a shadow moved in the distance. The trio froze, watching as a black SUV slowed near the entrance of the alley. A figure stepped out, their face partially obscured by a mask. "Barron Trump?" the masked figure said, their voice smooth yet threatening. "You've made a mistake." Barron stepped forward, his voice steady despite the danger. "You can threaten me all you want, but it won't stop the truth from coming out." Behind him, Julia and Rachel tensed, ready to react at a moment's notice. The standoff lasted a breathless moment, the tension thick enough to cut through the air. "Your fight ends here," the masked figure said finally, turning back toward the SUV. "Destroy the evidence." "No," Barron said firmly. "You've already lost. The world knows what's happening now." With a nod from Barron, Julia slipped the backpack from his hand, slipping it into a hidden compartment beneath her coat. The SUV roared to life, speeding away, leaving the alley in silence once again. "You can't stop us," Rachel added, her voice cutting through the quiet. "Your time is up." As the trio stood together, watching the shadows of the night reclaim the city, they knew that the fight wasn't over. It had only begun. The morning sun rose over a transformed Los Angeles. The wildfires had been contained, the conspiracy exposed, but the battle was far from over. Barron stood on the rooftop of a restored Griffith Observatory, a symbol of hope against corruption and destruction. Beside him, Julia and Rachel watched the city breathe again. A little slower, a little freer. The air was clearer, the streets calmer, but the weight of what they had uncovered still lingered. "We've made a difference," Barron said softly, his voice steady yet resolute. "But it's just the beginning." Julia nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "They'll come after us again, but this time we're ready." Rachel, with her notepad in hand, jotted down the final details of their journey. "And we'll make sure the world never forgets." Together, they looked out across the city, a city that had once been a playground for the corrupt but now stood on the edge of change. And as the sun continued to rise, so too did the call to action. Never stop seeking the truth. Never back down. The fight for a better future had only begun. Join the movement. Stay informed. Speak up. The truth belongs to us all.